I don't need therapy. All I need is the gym. Love is not real. Go to the gym. Anybody in the gym at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night is not there to get fit. They're here for revenge. Body dysmorphia or God complex? Life sucks, but you're a chill guy who likes to lift weights. Okay, chill guy. But why? Why do you like to lift weights?
Part 1. Men Made of Iron.
The first thing we need to untangle about bodybuilding is what it even is. Because if you look into it, it's not as straightforward as you might think. For starters, many debate the idea that it even is a sport at all. The easiest case against it is that it lacks a lot of the things that people usually associate with sports. There are no teams, no unique equipment, no goals to score into. It's also not included into any of the major interdisciplinary competitions around the world like the Olympics or the Pan American Games. And maybe most notably, there is no functional training. Although, put a pin on that one, we'll get back to functional training later. But on the other hand, if bodybuilding is not a sport, then what is it? Is it a fitness program? Is it just aesthetics? Maybe a beauty routine? No. It's hard to deny that it does have many factors that bring it close to traditional athleticism. To keep things simple, we are going to call bodybuilding a sport in this video. It's up to you whether you think it is or not, but it's worth pointing out how much of a nebulous concept we're facing from the get-go. But still, what is bodybuilding? Surely something about it is easy to figure out. Well, it's about training muscles for growth and aesthetics as opposed to strength. Take for example weightlifters or powerlifters. They aim to lift heavy, lift fast, and it's important that they do so consistently. In contrast, the core of bodybuilding is not about lifting at all. It is growing the body in a way that is balanced, symmetrical, and visually pleasing. The complete development of almost every single voluntary muscle in your body. No Kegels though, weirdly. Figure it out, boys. No, as the name says, it's all about building a body. Neck to toe perfection. But what does perfection look like? Now there's a loaded question. From what I've learned and in my own experience, bodybuilding stands on 3 core pillars: training, nutrition, and rest. A big part of bodybuilding is just straight up lifestyle. Do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you party? All of these significantly hinder your progress as a bodybuilder. When you take it seriously, bodybuilding is, in essence, one of the most rigorous purity systems in the world, strict enough to be compared to several religious dogmas across human history. Bodybuilding also has its unique set of rules, its own code of laws.
To the untrained eye, the hypermuscular male physique looks like a mess. Indeed, a mess of large lumps and bumps and other prodigious protuberances. To the trained eye, in contrast, each knob, ridge, and protrusion is fully legible, enhancing a whole whose parts have been built up according to laws as unambiguous and inflexible as those that once governed the construction of sonnets.
In that quote, Stephen Moore compares the body to poetry, which in a way makes sense. It is not just about getting a bigger and bigger body, that's for deviant art. Like poetry, bodybuilding has a language, a structure, and, of course, a point.
The overall impression, finally, should be one of absolute symmetry, no one muscle group overpowering any other, but all combining to overpower the spectator instead.
With this in mind, on the question of bodybuilding as a sport, there's another element to consider: competition. How do judges measure the worth of bodies? Well, by the grading of poses. This is a crucial element to competitive bodybuilding with unique factors that separate it from any other sport. Look at this. These poses are so contrived and unusual. Let's look at this, for example. The archer. The pose itself is completely useless for real archery. Their hands are too high, the body is tilted, there's not even a space for a bow in there. That's not the point. The real point is contorting and flexing the body in a way that shows it off in a unique way. Being eye-catching, while symmetry, development, and proportions can be judged.
Like its artistic forerunners, the pose indicates nothing beyond the power of human anatomy to transform itself into an instrument of expression.
There it is. Art. expression. One of the major reasons why people might be willing to dismiss bodybuilding as a sport is that sometimes, from certain angles, it looks more like an artistic practice than a sporting competition. It's not about team play, it's not about kicking a ball, it's not even two athletes facing off against each other. It's a pageant. Nowadays, bodybuilding is bigger than ever. Using social media, people can not only post their progress and show off, but a ton of bodybuilding discourse has developed for people to pitch in as to what is good and what is not. And they get competitive over there too, fighting for who's more right. TikTok, man. The absolute hellspace. I am a boomer trapped in the body of a zoomer. So put it all together and it's no surprise that bodybuilding attracts younger and younger men into this all-encompassing quasi-scientific cult of the male body. But it wasn't always like this.
Part 2. The Golden Path.
At no other point in history have we had such a comprehensive language to talk about our health like we do today. When making food for my husband, I ask him how much he wants by calories. It's ridiculous. We have services from counting macros to wellness programs, yoga, Pilates, diets, both intricate and simple, to obviously more invasive medical procedures. All this has brought the standard of expectations about our appearance to an unbelievably high level. We are supposed to take notice and act on anything that happens to us, no matter if it's life-threatening or purely cosmetic. Thanks to advertising and medical advancements, the past 300 years have conditioned us into thinking of our bodies as iron that we can hammer and pound into whatever shape we want. Iron. That word, bro. Bane of my existence. Iron. Our bodies went from being misunderstood and kind of esoteric into this almost mathematical equation. Whatever you put in would measurably reflect outward and have a noticeable reaction. The new body was a machine, able to be manipulated from the inside out. And more importantly for our discussion today, a machine that could be improved upon. 3 new sciences were born for our benefit. Nutrition studies, obviously, public hygiene, and, of course, physical education. From the mid-1800s, sports publications and health manuals were printed detailing the benefits of calisthenics as well as sports such as rowing, horseback riding, sailing, running, and, very notably, gymnastics. Originating in Germany, several gymnastics publications started making the rounds. They not only promoted a healthy lifestyle, but, and I can't stress this enough, gymnastics carries with it a big sense of showmanship. There's a reason why such an old sport has survived until now. It's no surprise then that these programs caught on. People were not only keen to stay healthy and improve their skills, but gymnastics is just cool to look at. We've always loved looking at humans doing cool stuff. Early YouTube can attest to that. One of the biggest markets in which gymnastics picked up speed was, of course, children. Schools started adopting them into their courses, and very early on, gymnastics was seen as the best all-around workout regime. The most flexible path towards health, strength, flexibility, in other words, the perfect body. While this was all happening, another major sporting institution was picking up traction, one which we've covered before on the channel. The Olympics. As different countries were standardizing education and physical programs were finding a home in there, different governing bodies started to more rigorously test the theories about gymnastics. And while they found out that it was a pretty suitable sport, especially for younger people, it wasn't the only way towards a better body. 2 rivals were rising to notoriety. One that promoted even more muscle mass and strength, and the other speed and agility. Weightlifting and athletics. The past 150 years have changed every sport, and lifting is no different. Although a key factor is that, generally speaking, lifting is more accessible than gymnastics. If you don't have the energy to be bouncing off the walls or bones made of rubber, you can still lift weights. On the other hand, while lifting took a little over 20 years to enter the Olympics and gain some sort of validation with that, athletics have been there since the very beginning. Run fast, throw far, jump high. Pretty easy to understand, right? All this to say, the idea of the perfect body as promoted by gymnastics fell under a lot of scrutiny and was dethroned pretty early on. A body proficient at gymnastics would not do good at weightlifting, for example. But people were still holding on hope to finding the golden path towards perfection. Now, bodybuilding itself developed as an offshoot of weightlifting, as people realized that more muscle mass didn't necessarily mean more strength. And while there remained many athletes who were dead fast on lifting as heavy and reliably as they could, others were more captivated by the idea of growing big. It started spreading in the mid to late 1800s, but it was widespread enough that in 1901, the very first bodybuilding competition was held in London in the Royal Albert Hall. Little side note, but did you also know that this was the very first venue to hold the indoor marathon? Imagine them going around that stage hundreds and hundreds of times. Crazy. Anyway, let's take a tiny step back to talk about spectacle. Before the Olympics with its track and field, before the gymnastics of it all, displays of athleticism were most often made by street performers. People paid to see them in fairs, the circus, even in the vaudeville. They weren't the most objective ways of testing strength, of course, and more than anything else, they were aimed at charming an audience. So naturally, they were rigged more often than not. But what they did accomplish was capturing a taste for this kind of entertainment. A hunger people had to see for strong people, especially men, going beyond the limits of what they thought was possible. By the 1920s, these shows had kind of fallen out of fashion, and by then, weightlifting had become its own respectable sport. But in the pursuit of being fair and objective, they kind of left behind the showmanship that people had gotten used to. It is in this junction between fitness and health, spectacle and voyeurism, where bodybuilding found its niche. Most people agree that the first bodybuilder, or the first one to rise to prominence, was this guy, Sandow. Early into his career, he really lent into that circus aesthetic, and during his shows, he'd often be in several stages of undress. Magic Mike could never. He became really famous, really fast, partly from his shows, but also from the marketing around the shows. He was often called the perfect man. I think to our modern eyes, he hardly looks perfect, but back then people were not used to seeing anyone like him. Sandow became pretty influential in the budding sport of bodybuilding, and was even a judge at that first competition in 1901. Look at him, there he is. As time went on, more and more people began to copy Sandow, but not only that, they tested and adapted his methods, building upon them. More and more people who weren't athletes also started developing a taste for bodybuilding. Audiences wanted to see them become more expressive, more unique. Each bodybuilder that rose to fame had their own spin on things, their own personality. They tailored their physique to exude power or confidence or grace. From then on, bodybuilding would show a steady growth as people from all over the world took notice and competitions increased, both in the number of athletes and spectators. When it became big in the US, it had a particularly big boom, but it also caused a bit of a moral panic. One which we'll get back to later. For a few decades, bodybuilding survived within its niche behind closed doors. That is, until Arnie. If Sandow built his image from live shows, Arnie did the same with films. First in a documentary, which later transformed into dozens of roles in features. And soon enough, he wasn't on his own. Dozens of bodybuilders around the world found success in films and television, even developing their own genres. So in time, we got used to them. Seeing bodies like these became at once otherworldly and mundane. A man reimagined as a hero of legend, but not too far removed that the average guy couldn't find it aspirational. Jump to nowadays, where things have changed, but not that much. The fitness boom of the 80s and 90s normalized gym culture. These days, it's not hard to find a gym in a big city, and seeing people work out is pretty ordinary. And then with the internet, you can go online and find dozens of workouts that suit your needs, skill level, the equipment available to you. We are no longer just consumers either. Anyone can become a creator as well, sharing their journeys. Throwback Tuesday, Transformation Thursday. The sport of bodybuilding owes as much to the athletes as it does to the people who make media about it. The photographers, filmmakers, bloggers, Instagram posters. They are the ones who keep this spectacle alive. Of course, nowadays, one can perform both roles. The era of the body transformation had set in. The idea that the human body is a machine that can be manipulated into anything you want is still pretty much alive, maybe stronger than ever. I think our concept of the perfect body is not as one-dimensional anymore, but it's still there. That speaks to a core belief in us. The idea that perfecting a body is a process worth undertaking in the first place. It's a loaded term, and one we kind of take for granted. The idea that some bodies are worth more than others, and that having a beautiful body is an accomplishment in and of itself. You see this in everyday life. I don't need to explain this to you. It's hot or not. It's social media. It's hypergamy. And of course, it's in bodybuilding as well. Despite being shrouded in mathematics and ratio, symmetry and balance, it's still a pageant of male beauty. Some bodybuilders claim that it's not about looks and it's only about accomplishment. But I think that might be cope because we're not used to the idea of celebrating masculine beauty. But for most of human history, at least in the West, the central object of beauty was not women, but men. It's only relatively recently that this has been inverted. And I think that comes from factors that are too complex for us to understand in this little video, unless, say, we were to take a long tangent where we would chronicle the attitude towards male beauty through the ages, but who's got time for that?
Part 3. Heavenly Bodies.
Don't you just hate it when you finally figured out your shot and it's the last day of the shoot? Arguably, the 3 most influential art periods here in the West revolved around the bodies of dudes. The male body was not only the norm, it was the ideal. Let's start with the Greeks. We could definitely go further back. There's some really cool stuff there, like Assyrian or Sumerian art. I think it's esoteric, really cool, very trippy. But for today, we'll start with the Greeks. The majority of Greek art is, of course, about their extensive pantheon of gods. There are plenty of pieces that depict normal daily life, but the art they deemed worthy of contemplation and praise was 100% religious. That said though, some of their oldest surviving works don't depict gods, they show athletes. Something that will become apparent is that depictions of gods and athletes are not all that different. Historians of the past had trouble distinguishing which was which because, to be fair, there are only a handful of signs for us to figure it out. Back then, it was the ultimate flattery to be unrecognizable from a god. It equates your success to theirs. That tells you how much they valued athletes and their achievements. Part of that comes from their ideas about health, which basically meant that the more beautiful you looked, the healthier you must be. A beautiful, fit man was the role model. The original it boy. But even thinking like this, there are split ways to interpret heavenly beauty.
In the 6th century, the typical athlete as portrayed in art is the strong man, the boxer or wrestler, depicted as a vigorous, heroic male without any suggestion of sexual attraction, the personification of power and endurance. By the 5th century, however, the fully developed adult male tends to be replaced by the athletic youth, not merely strong, but also beautiful and graceful. Indeed, as remarkable for physical beauty as for his bodily strength.
So generally speaking, there were 2 archetypes of male beauty emerging. The powerful male body, which is an object of admiration, and the beautiful male body, the object of erotic or quasi-love interest. While our modern eyes might interpret the latter as less masculine, that wasn't necessarily the intention back then. Their representation of men is twofold for a reason. This hair, man, it is driving me crazy. The hypermasculine is supposed to be admired. Greek cosmology relied on the importance of victory during combat against the external world. Self-mastery rather than self-abandonment to the infinite, which is something that we see in many religions today. But we're not there yet. This speaks to the fundamentally activist nature of ancient Greek religion, a fascination of man's achievements within his mortal limits. The man becomes a hero. Look at the muscles of these sculptures. They're not naturalistic, and that was never the point. What they aimed for was an aspiration towards, or perhaps an invocation, of a perfected state of being. This body might be beautiful, but it reflects the beauty of a wrathful god. It is a body too powerful to be touched, too intimidating. It has no place in the world of the viewer. So on one hand you've got the heroic, and on the other the alluring, both equally divine. The first is exaggerated to appear monolithic, the latter toned back to seem less threatening. They were all advertisements for Femboy Symposium. I'm sorry, Miss Points. In the end, one incurs desire and the other does not. At least not intentionally. I mean, It is worth mentioning that throughout ancient Greek history, not everyone enjoyed this masculine binary. Sometimes you hear about these crazy cults that revolve around gender, and I think this kind of shows a light as to why. Being drunk or high or whatever offered people an escape from their bodies, from this all-encompassing cult of heroic masculinity, but those were usually just an exception. Oh my god, the collie ears. It's happening. Let me tell you about my favorite sculpture in the British Museum. It is this guy. He's supposed to be a Pancration? He's an athlete, he's a fighter, and he's got collie ears. Let's fast forward a few centuries to the Romans. As we know, they borrowed a lot of art, culture, religion, and social narratives from their Greek predecessors, but their attitudes were not entirely the same. For one, they were not as ready to depict men naked, especially if it was about real people. Besides, nobility in ancient Rome wanted to show off their wealth, and clothes were expensive, so they wanted to show them off in their monuments. Fashion as a status symbol is something that we'll come back to a few times, so keep it in the back of your mind. So the representation of male bodies changed a little, but not that much. The Greek influence in Roman culture was so strong that at several points people had to be actively encouraged to seek out a more Roman way of doing things. One of those, which became iconic for centuries later, was the queer ass. Queer ass? Bro, come on. Queer ass, queer ass. Queer ass. It's this thing, part of the armor. Basically a sculpted breastplate with abs. The cuirass ended up being a middle ground between the two cultures. On the one hand, it was modeled after Greek heroes and gods and their statues, which meant that the wearer inherited some semblance of heroism. At the same time, they wore armor, which paired nicely with other clothes. This way, a general, for example, could wear it and be portrayed as a hero regardless of what their body actually looked like. In a way, it became a sort of mask.
By simplifying and codifying the images of a strong, beautiful male, Roman art turned the torso into an instantly recognizable symbol of heroic strength and power.
Slowly, a complicated language of depicting masculinity came to be. The different styling of hair, beards, shoes, jewelry. As men lived, they learned through their bodies how to more suitably invoke masculinity. Now, what happens when attitudes about the body change, and where once we found glory and pride, now there is only shame. In many ways, Christianity, especially early on, revolved around making sense of pain. So it's not that people were particularly morally aligned with each other, but more so that it was easy to find a common enemy. This is herd mentality. I think that's why very old countries like England or Germany, despite being pretty geographically small, have a wide variety of accents and regional cultures. People formed strong connections to the specific area they were in. In versus out group mentality became dominant over almost anything else. Life was hard. Poverty, disease, child mortality rates were through the roof. And to make it all worse, they had closed down femboy symposiums. People had huge problems staring them in the face. Philosophical doubts like, what is the place of mankind in the universe, were too big of an inquiry. There was so much trouble down here to take unanswerable questions like that seriously. So instead of becoming angsty over something we had no power over, most medieval attitudes were instead focused on the smaller scope of what is the place of mankind in society. That is a pragmatic question that yields pragmatic answers. Survival. The point of medieval art wasn't about teaching men to be better. It was about making society bearable for whoever was lucky enough to be in the norm. The constant attack on life and fear of death were key parts of Christian theology at the time. When things suck so much and almost none of us were heroes, people became jaded with the glorification of the body. It became much easier to hold contempt for aesthetic human contemplation, so the depictions of bodies changed radically. Little side note, but this is why I really like the depictions of angels in SMT5. They cover their bodies head to toe and wear a mask to hide their faces. They are genderless and only show any part of their bodies if they absolutely must. It's a very faithful take on the design. I like. Anyways, as opposed to the Greeks, in Christianity, the naked body is not a sign of pride, but of shame, vulnerability, and guilt. The very first story they tell, that of Adam and Eve, narrates the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. They were two people entirely at peace with their bodies and each other's until they were flung into a state of perpetual shame. All natural processes like eating, defecating, menstruating, childbirth, and especially sex became symbols of pollution and corruption and weakness. This sprung a disease of alienation, a feeling of being foreign to your own flesh. The popular saying, "my body is a temple," is loaded with two meanings. One, that out there exists inherently profane things that you can do to your body or put into it, and two, that it houses something of higher value. The idea that the body and the soul are two different things is something that goes back all the way to Plato and maybe even before, but it wouldn't really pick up steam until much later. When Christianity came along, a lot of people were unhappy with the state of the world. All the things that the Romans praised, many borrowed from the Greeks, like the pursuit of pleasure, conquest, and feasting, were increasingly reserved for the higher classes. People felt rejected from society and held back from that which would bring them glory. So if the body could not be indulged in, the spirit offered a new gateway. Everything that caused envy was suddenly toxic and corrosive by nature. In heaven, our bodies are washed away and we become one with God. So whatever pleasures your body can provide are insignificant when compared to the ultimate reward. Mere temptations to be mastered. Pretty good propaganda, if you ask me. The problem with this mindset is that by putting all of the benefits at the end, it brings the focus during life on all of the things that bring you down. As a consequence, the most distinctive feature of Christian art is to glorify suffering, both of the other and the self. All of a sudden, the ideal man was no longer a hero whose exploits brought him fame, not an athlete who would push himself to higher achievement, but instead, an ascetic. Imagery of death and humiliation is not unheard of in Greek art, but in Christianity, well, we could be here all day. The central symbol of Christianity is the figure of a tortured man. To put the cross into context, we need to talk about torture. Before the judicial systems of today, the act of carrying out justice fell onto the shoulders of executioners, and nowhere did they have more freedom to follow their whims than in a crucifixion. Even at the time, people were actively objecting to the inhuman torture that it often devolved into. Early depictions of Christian stories often stay away from the humiliation of Christ, I think in an attempt to appeal to that Greco-Roman heroic mindset. He is the Good Shepherd, the King of Kings, who even in death suffers no agonies. Christ rises triumphant over the cross, while Judas suffers an indignant death. But make no mistake, there is a bubbling resentment here, a bitterness from being cheated by the brevity and hardship of life. The obsession with death really came into shape in the late medieval age, when the crucifix became much more common. Europe was being ravaged by diseases and plague, like syphilis for example, so for people to see their pain reflected on their god was more #relatable, I guess. Take, for example, this painting by Matthias Grunwald. Grunwald? Which was made for a monastery where sick people found treatment. Some claim that seeing God in their own diseased image helped them objectify their bodies and ease their suffering. In the end, their souls would be saved anyway, right?
The crucifixion of Jesus is not an event in the past that happened to one person only. On the contrary, it is a cruel chastisement being meted out to all those who suffered, and suffer still. Contemporary sufferers see in Jesus their own suffering.
So on one hand, Christians found solace on the pain of Christ, both from the ravages of disease as well as the very palpable fear of aging, while at the same time, maybe sometimes enjoying just a little bit of schadenfreude, enjoying the spiteful glee in the suffering of the unfaithful. Many such cases. The male and his body went from the epitome of godhood, an ideal to aspire and build towards, to the literal devil. For a couple centuries, all nakedness was tied with sin, guilt, and shame, distorting the body into inhuman shapes and sickly hues, offering only selfishness and deceit. So we have a choice to make. to be tortured and disfigured until our sins are burnt to a crisp and there is very little left of us, if anything at all, or to fall into the Lord's grace, where there is no pain and there is no torture, but that's only because man can no longer distinguish his will from that of the Lord's. Putting aside the devil, let's talk about the two most famous and most naked men in Christianity. The nakedness of Adam is shameful and reminds us of the innocence we lost, of betrayal, the burden of the body. His mistake is to blame for the uphill climb that our lives will inevitably become. On the other hand, the body of Christ is reborn and unshackled from sin at the cost of a painful, brutal, and bloody death. Yikes. Where in the Middle Ages, improvement of man was strictly a religious matter, in the Renaissance we saw a massive shift. Now we were to find progress in the intersections of science, technology, history, psychology, sociology, and king above all, medicine. For centuries, any practice of anatomy was severely hindered by the fact that studying on dead bodies was very much forbidden. It wasn't only a matter of honoring and respecting the dead, but cutting up a body was also an affront to God. This would all change during the Renaissance. Suddenly there were anatomical studies happening in public and they were huge spectacles. This more relaxed perspective on the body made it so many of the established prejudices were challenged. During this time, art and science went hand in hand. As new knowledge of the human body became publicly accessible, artists began to create portrayals that were more anatomically correct. Medieval art looked so disproportionate partly because they didn't know the intricacies of the body, but maybe more so because accuracy was never really the goal. It was always more figurative. In art, depictions of the body usually fall within one of two categories. Formalist, which is to say accurate. Often this portrays the body as it is, with whatever beauty it might have. And expressiveness, which is evocative. It's supposed to give you an idea. It's more concerned with narrative than realism. Medieval art fell into the latter. But now in the Renaissance, artists began to flex their skills on how well they could represent the complex connections of muscle, bone, and flesh. Proportions became a mathematical science as people were more confident in their craft. This reveals one of the key aspects of the Renaissance, a mix of contradictory attitudes, pragmatic mathematics and mysticism, scientific anatomy and the belief in a metaphysical meaning to the proportions of humans. Another side note, but a game that really portrays this very well is actually Metaphor Re Fantasio. Not only in how it's literally visually inspired by medieval and Renaissance art, but because the lore, the UI, the character design all intertwine the magical and the scientific. It's cool stuff. Anyway, with so many artists paying attention to the human body, a new standard was formed, the archetypal male. But this brought with it a few unintended side effects. Because most studies focused on men's bodies, the male body was solidified as the default human. Even with all the advancements going on, people would be reluctant to study the female body, alive or dead. And to be honest, we see the consequences of this to this very day. Arguably, maybe, potentially, the Renaissance was a step back in gender equality, or at least it created a lot of baggage for us to deal with. Under a certain light, the medieval ages shunned all bodies equally, whereas now there was a fascination with the male body exclusively. You can see this in action with some artists like Michelangelo, where it's clear that even the female representations are actually studies of the male body with a flimsy veneer of femininity draped over. A male washing, if you will. At the time, a favorite character from Greek mythology was Hercules, and I think it's very easy to see why. First, he was known for his muscles, so that gave artists a chance to go wild with the gains. All his different labors were pretty diverse and interesting, so if you wanted to paint nature or a portrait or a fight, there was a lot to pick from. Herc kept coming up in different places as a local hero, with seemingly everybody in Europe claiming ancestry to him at one point or another. I think Hercules' story inherently lends itself well to a Christian worldview. Dante compared Hercules and Antaeus to David and Goliath, and many scholars agree that Samson might have been an early Christian adoption of Greek myth, with loads of images that depict their similarities. 16th century Christianity felt itself to be threatened on all sides, and Hercules' role as the victor over evildoers took on an increasingly political edge. Herc is a good boy, and he is liked for it. He is also self-effacing, and he is loved for that. It made it easy to identify with, so people could just paint themselves as Hercules, transferring onto them his strengths and accomplishments. It's like the cuirass with the Romans. So during the Renaissance, when people started to more academically go through the remnants of Greek culture, you know that Hercules just spoke to them. A big, huge man from myth with big, huge muscles. Love it. Now, as the decades of the Renaissance sped past, artists kept trying to one-up each other when it came to expression and artistry. The style of paintings and sculptures slowly transformed from naturalistic towards more theatrical and dramatic scenes. This went for all the usual suspects. Hercules, as we went through, Narcissus, of course, athletes, monarchs, nobility, but interestingly, portrayals of Jesus underwent the same changes. Artists and members of the church insisted on exalting the beauty of Christ as a sign of his virtue. He became a titan, his victory over death reaching its full heroic potential. To be honest, sometimes it's a little hard to distinguish a figure of Christ than that of a Greek god. He's massive, swole, remove the cross and the differences become scant. This had an effect on how people perceived and talked about Jesus. He became less relatable and larger than life, barely human. In this way, Christ was brought back to Greek antiquity, to heroism. This kind of summarizes the folly of the Renaissance, doesn't it? While it started as a hunger for knowledge that tied mysticism and science together, by the end it was strained by opposing forces of artistic opulence and religious worship. Depictions of ancient stories and Christian alike were leaning more towards scandal rather than purity. As artists battled to depict Christ as realistically as possible, they very often crossed the line, presenting instead a seductive, inviting body. Christ was sexy now. Imagine that. This is why the artists who followed after the Renaissance, called Mannerists, show more sophisticated takes on sexuality. They create tension only to dissipate it and remind us that life is a game. It's all irony. They keep in mind that a desire to reform and improve the flesh ends up by deforming it. The cult of elegance always tends away from nature and leans towards death. The decades following show a very pronounced change. Art was meant to be meaningful, an expression of life, so the emerging figures drew things back to nature, back to color, back to movement and life. Renaissance and Mannerist artists were obsessed with themselves, with the breakthroughs they could accomplish and how to rationalize it all. But even the brightest idea can become pedestrian when people open their eyes to it. It was time for a change. From the scorching Greek sun to the icy contempt of medieval winter, men's bodies had weathered it all. It isn't until fairly recently, in the grand scheme of things, that women start to show up in the conversation. The Rococo aesthetic was one of outward beauty and excess. Motifs of nature blossom out of every corner as man posits himself in the middle, the master of nature, rising to claim dominion. The presentation of the body became much more elaborate and complex. These now had to justify themselves in one way or another, and more often than not, it was through invoking mythology. The body itself was just not as interesting anymore. In the purview of Rococo, clothes are a fetish. The erotic, rather than the nude, is the striptease, the art of false modesty. Gender aesthetics moved away from the body itself and transferred fully onto the clothing that adorned it. A muscled body might have been seen as attractive, but it was less meaningful than a shrouded one. Fashion is central to this era of humanity. A new bourgeois was born, more interested in image than in power. It's also unsurprising that women were at the center of Rococo. If there ever was a time to be a girly, this was it. Art, interior design, fashion all moved towards the domain of women. The indoors, the hidden, the bedroom. Women, or at least upper class women, found new power and social mobility like never before. You know who didn't like this very much? Men. Obviously, working class men who lived away from the rose garden, forging a life in the muck and the mud. This would inspire several ideas that reach us to this day. Men rejecting the indoors, the comfortable, the pretty. Make something of yourself, chant the male philosophers. They glorify the fields, the yards, manual labor, the body that is unconcerned with beauty or sexuality. This was one of the most remarkable steps in defining the aesthetics of masculinity in the modern age. The bliss of being admired like a gem and the pleasure of finding use like an instrument.
If sexuality became the central narrative of Rococo, seductive sensuality seemed to represent the decadence of contemporary art and of the corrupt and exhausted society which fostered it.
It was the Romans all over again. Here we start to see another attitude that reaches us to this day. The contempt for the effeminate man. A man that fed on adoration and contented himself without the hardship of labor was decidedly not male. These ideas had been around for long before this, but it was almost like men were radicalized by the advancements in fashion and gender aesthetics. I hope you can start to see why I've brought you on this journey so far. All these attitudes have been passed down onto us, and they inform the very real ways we think about the bodies of men. Religious or not, we are likely to be molded by these ideas. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We can see these attitudes in art, how people painted the male body, perhaps reluctant to show their flesh, staying shy and bashful like they didn't want the attention. Others went the complete opposite way, focusing on pain, death, and decay, where the body becomes an obscene, bestial object. Either way, men were a difficult subject to take on. Slowly, new artists would adopt less complicated perspectives, and while they were a breath of fresh air, they kind of solidified the gender roles that they inherited. From around the early 1800s, we can get a clear sense of sexuality and their aesthetics that's honestly not too different from what we see today. Men belonged outdoors as active agents of society, while women found whatever freedom was afforded as being objects of desire. Feminism? In dire need, my guy. Within art, the portrayal of male bodies dwindled to almost nothing, as admiring the beauty of women was pretty much the only option. Men were taught to enjoy and possess that passion, a dominion over sexual desire, or at least that was the intention.
19th century prudishness was specifically a middle-class phenomenon, an assertion of moral and special respectability against a decadent aristocracy, and against the masses who were seen as licentious and potentially subversive.
But the thing is, prudishness reveals anxiety, not just about the body, but also about society at large. Sex serves as a reminder that we are animals, that we are flesh. See, during the Enlightenment, truth and justice were thought to be within man's reach. Thanks to the philosophers and artists, the living, beating heart of humans took center stage. The passions of man, both rational and emotional, at the crossroads between philosophy and science. A protest against a world slowly drained of spirituality. During this time, studies and discussions of male bodies were entirely out of fashion. The masculine body became more mundane, less mythologized, while the female body took the exact opposite route. Either way, it was gaining new political dimensions. Painters were now taken by narrative, focused on drama and symbolism, more so than with any academic portrayal of realism. Outside the world of art, something started appearing very important to our discussion today. A specific culture of sport and the promotion of a healthy lifestyle. People welcomed the narrative that nurturing the body would also benefit the soul. And as we've already seen, the 1800s saw the birth of several exercise regimes and entirely new forms of fitness. In many ways, the Enlightenment was a repeat of the progressivism of the Renaissance. Following that, the turn of the century would unfold in unexpected ways, including the proper birth of bodybuilding. Hang on, I need to change it up a little bit. We've been recording today for far too long. Today my husband told me that with this hat on, I look like a Rolf. So, there you go. Rolf.
You're killing it, Rolf.
From their very origins, the human body was the key object of study for two new art forms. A lot of the earliest pictures we have are portraits, and one of the earliest film experiments is, by no matter of coincidence, the video of a bodybuilder. That's our good friend Zando, by the way, because who else would it be? Additionally, the modernist era is marked by two new avenues for art. advertising, and propaganda. In some ways, the burgeoning mass media was giving boys a complicated language that taught them what they needed to be a man and where to buy it. On the other hand, governments of the world were using gender aesthetics, particularly masculinity, to create visions of the future, to instill meaning in a world sinking into war and poverty. These bodies are not meant to be enticing, but to inspire an image of a healthy, pure body. As we said, the body is political. Some people claim that bodybuilding is inherently fascistic because of its use in propaganda, but I think that's too simple of an answer. While it's true that there is a link there, I think that speaks more to the men that are influenced by the propaganda rather than muscularity itself. Hypermasculine aesthetics have existed for way longer than fascism, and they don't get to claim them. But we'll get back to that. Now, if you want to talk about a political body in the 20th century, there is no movement that would take center stage over feminism. From the shifting attitudes in the First World War to the establishment of a female presence in the workplace in the Second, women's bodies and womanhood were being redefined. The 50s and 60s were a tipping point and opened the floodgates of sexual transformation.
That was my trouble. That was why I felt so queer.
It's important to point out that in this regard, masculinity has not had such a wide journey in comparison. For the most part, it stayed the same, other than hippie fads and special cases like rock stars. Exceptions, but not the rule. The earliest responses to feminism were obviously of repression, which you would expect, but not just to female bodies, but male as well. The attention and momentum that bodybuilding had enjoyed for the latter part of the 19th century were suddenly put on a standstill. And honestly, it's not hard to see why audiences were so scandalized by bodybuilding. In some ways, it's always been a radical sport. We'll touch on it later, but even though I think bodybuilding does have functional training, not everyone sees it that way. Besides, the inherently exhibitionist nature of the sport was always an easy target for critique. People found it just too polarizing. So in order to survive, it had to go underground with all the other deviants. This monolithic puritanism cast a shadow so dark that bodybuilding had to find a new home. Luckily, it wouldn't be too long until bodybuilding found a new audience. We'll get back to that in a second. But first, I need to tell you some more about art. I'm not even gonna lie to you, bro. Being this pretentious is really fun. To make a long story short, the invention of photography kind of sent the art world into a tizzy. The achievement of portraying someone accurately in a painting was instantly devalued when a photo could do the same much faster. This led to the obvious question of what is the point of art, which surprisingly is not an easy question to answer. Less so the matter of good art. Little by little, the decades following brought along more questions about the nature of art, and picked away at the established canons of the art world. High art as a category was kind of dissolved because it had no use anymore. High art, in case you don't know, is a concept that divides good art from bad. It's the stuff you see in museums. Basically mainstream art. But now that authority just wasn't as strong anymore. And if whoever was left in the salons, the highbrow artists, were less interested in the portrayal of heroic masculinity, well, it passed on to the hands of popular media, advertisements, adventure stories, comic books, even early blockbusters. The idealized male body was translated into new, catchy, colorful media, which usually meant one of two depictions: nostalgia for a past long forgotten, or a future imagining of superhuman strength and beauty. Gladiator films were pretty common, appearing both in Italy and the States. At the same time, films involving Tarzan appeared all over the world, and they were seemingly a little more universally appealing. People wanted to see honky dudes on screens, and he delivered. In part, Tarzan as a character reveals a desire for the untamed male body, freed from the restrictions of civilization and social conventions. One with nature, active, free, and completely unaware of his beauty.
The ultimate version of the newborn pin-up is Tarzan, a perfect physical specimen, strong and brave and virile, and as innocent as the day he was born. Jane has to teach him everything: how to eat at the table, dress, read, write. She creates him, transforms him into a modern adult man, much as the schoolmarm teaches the cowboy.
Now, there's another obvious development in media here with a lot of crossover to what we're talking about: the comic book. They sprung up around this time as well and caught on quickly, capturing the youth of the time. Let's look at the most famous one of all, Superman. The name says it all. He's the ultimate man. He's got super strength, he can fly, he puts the world to right, and look at his body. A Greek hero if I've ever seen one. Soon enough, Superman wouldn't be alone as dozens of characters joined him in what I would call the modern pantheon of heroes. Popular heroic characters always reflect what's going on in the world at the time, and the 40s are a great example for this. Simple stories for kids and teens, sure, but they sparked the imagination with fantasies of triumph over the enemies of freedom and democracy. Superman, Spider-Man, Captain America, Wonder Bread, the forces of evil required to be met by even more effective forces of good. That is all from this book, which is honestly such a banger. Who wrote this? Kenneth R. Dutton is a professor of French at the University of Newcastle, Australia. Oh, it's Kenneth! Superheroes show a more refined approach to the heroic male body and are a clear evolution from Tarzan. Superman and Spider-Man, for example, are closeted bodybuilders.
They wore bodysuits that decently covered their flesh and masks that disguised their identity. Their lives were rigidly divided between bodiless bourgeois respectability and muscular superhero fantasy. They led a double life that no one knew about.
These characters effectively teach boys how to be law-abiding members of society while entertaining power fantasies. The warrior and the good boy all rolled up into one. Nice. While we have a ton of superhero movies these days, bodybuilders in the 70s found success in other types of films, notably less family-friendly films. They were soldiers, killers, renegade men, taking justice into their own hands. And the more naked he was, the more deadlier he had to become. Politically, the world was becoming more tense, more dangerous. Everyone was trying to be more badass than the guy before. It honestly got ridiculous. In time, however, audiences would get bored of this as well, and people would be more relaxed around male bodies. So by the 80s, with disco, sexual liberation, more access to fitness, the warrior persona was no longer needed.
Good point. Let's go. Show us how it's done.
Bodybuilders had once again been displaced by the media and had to find a new home, notably in comedies this time. The Rocky Horror Picture Show is a good sign of this.
The knowing winks and mocking self-awareness were in themselves a form of inverted recognition of these images as part of the Western cultural baggage, including that of the ideal muscular development as the embodiment of the American dream.
One day I will cosplay Rocky. One day. Basically, bodybuilding had found a home in camp, because let's face it, fellas, this is peak camp. So, let's see where that leaves us. From the Greeks, we learned that the male body is a symbol of civilization itself. The act of nurturing the body and exercising is in itself embedding in us the idea that one day we too could become perfect. In a way, a muscled body tells us that we don't need protection. It's like armor without the armor. From the Christians, we inherited a sense of using our bodies for social betterment. That discipline and wrangling the body is good for the soul, actually. That the flesh is decadent, yet can be sanctified through suffering. No pain, no gain. From the Renaissance, we picked up a pattern of perfection, a set of heavenly proportions at once sensual and idealistic. A man in complete balance. From the Romantics, we learned that the body is not worthy if it is not put to work. And finally, from contemporary writers, we learned that the appetite for heroic males, for buff dudes, is still very much alive. That the body is a symptom of psychic health and a projection of the ego. All of this comes together and boils over to create modern masculinity. It is just so much baggage that you wouldn't realize if you don't stop to think about it. With all this in mind, to truly understand bodybuilding, we now have to talk about what actually makes a man.
Part 4. Architecture of Men.
Honestly, this outfit looks so much better with the glasses. It's very... yeah. When I first got these glasses, my partner said that I look like Dahmer. What's the point, bro? While I was researching this video, I came across a very interesting quote from a bodybuilder in which he claims the sport has actually brought him closer to his girlfriend, specifically because she was a ballet dancer. And when you think about it, it's not hard to see the parallels. It's a spectacle where the athlete goes on stage, they do a little ditty, and the audience claps. Little ditty. As an athlete, you're supposed to achieve the impossible, all while making it look effortless, an unshakable smile plastered onto your face. The eating habits, the pressure to perform, the sacrifices one has to make. It's unsurprising that while they're on opposite ends of gender presentation, these two would find common ground like this. It's horseshoe theory in practice. At the root of it, there is one thing which clearly links ballet and bodybuilding. They are sports that rely on showmanship. The bodybuilder's goal is appearance, not action. A meticulous construction of, well, the body. See? I'm clever.
It's good to look outrageous.
Large.
But you can't just savage out every day. You've got to think about the shape of your muscles, the symmetry and cuts.
Striation.
Everything has to fit together.
Both ballet and bodybuilding in practice are a lot of lineups where any imperfection gets you marked down. The judges are looking for perfect balance, otherwise you're out. Like it or not, appearances are everything, along with skill. That's why I think there is a functional aspect to the kind of training that bodybuilding requires. You don't go on stage and just stand there. You flex in specific patterns, you control your breathing, you present in particular ways, and you hide everything that goes on behind it. The purpose of bodybuilding training is to accomplish all that as best as you can. Plus, good posing takes practice. It's not as simple as you might think. As cringe as it is for me to go around the gym with my little camera recording myself, the fact is, I fit right in. This is a sport of spectacle and voyeurism. From training to posing to competing, bodybuilding is all about looking at men's bodies. Except if you're a lady, which in that case, it's about looking at women's bodies. But there is one key difference between ballet and bodybuilding. When a bodybuilder goes on stage, there is no story for them to follow. No plot being conveyed, no themes, no narrative. All that they do is portray an image, a distillation of bodily potential at its peak. To the untrained eye, all they see is a mass of muscles that looks lumpy and bulbous. But to those in the know, the language of bodybuilding is written in striations and symmetry and proportions. These symbols are what transform a body into something greater, from meaningless flesh into the embodiment of peak mankind. It's no coincidence that many publications, like those early ones with Sando in them, often called the developed builder's body perfect. To have the perfect body means to be the perfect human, the perfect man. A body is not just a body. All men are forced to contend with this idea of masculine perfection, whether we realize it or not. Thanks to media, movies, socials, we get a constant verification of this benchmark. This is why if you find yourself scrolling the posts of someone with a physique that you'd like to have, it can very quickly switch from inspiration into a form of self-harm. You poison yourself with envy. We've all been there. When we take into account everything we've been through, from the historic perspective of the male body to the influence of advertising and the general pressure to perform, we come to find that reconciling the ownership of a male body is just not as easy as it sounds. It's a loaded subject, and one which understandably brings anxiety to a lot of men. Earlier ages dealt with the feelings of human frailty and weakness by belittling the significance of pleasure and the earthly experience as a whole, though nowadays that's paradoxically impossible. We have so many tools at our disposal that we are expected to be in control at all times. In an era where we're supposed to stay healthy and achieve bodily excellence, we are demanded to have a more definite stance on our bodies. Whether we think of our body in terms of its potential with great pride or shame and disgust, staying neutral is not an easily achievable option. Then there's this subject of gender. It's obvious that not all fitness is for better health, and not all bodybuilding is for better fitness. There's a very clear link between bodybuilding and gender construction. This is a subject that's been in flux for several decades now. The past century has been in turmoil non-stop when it comes to gender and sexuality. There's been a very noticeable and tangible need to adapt and rediscover femininity, while for the most part, masculinity has remained pretty rigid, for good or bad. What is a woman? Bro, what is a man? The number of jobs that require manual labor, which for centuries has been a signifier of masculinity, are becoming more scant by the year. On the flip side, the 1% of rich, powerful leadership, in other words, economic success, is beyond reach for most of us. It makes sense that bodybuilding would be so important for a lot of young men. It captures a sense of masculinity that's hard to get otherwise. It's gender affirming, a confirmation that you are male and that it feels good. Now, there's something that we haven't discussed, and here's where things get a little metaphysical. I think there's something that we take for granted which pretty much informs every single decision we make. Why do we derive meaning from our bodies? Well, as we went through in many religions across the world, notably the Abrahamic ones, there is a very clear distinction between body and soul. That you are more than just a bag of bones and meat. Almost an implicit understanding that the body is a source of corruption, while the soul is everlasting and pure. And low-key, high-key, bodybuilding plays right into this. You don't have to be spiritual to participate in the sport, obviously, but the level of self-policing that it requires, the desire to wrangle control over every muscle, depriving yourself of pleasure, and putting this rigorous focus on purity at the center of your mind. This might just be me, but I think this speaks to a certain contempt we hold for our bodies, one that we might not even notice because we're so used to it. Why do you think so many bodybuilders are people who are used to feeling ignored or weak, who have body image issues, or who are just nerds? Nerds who find it hard to maintain healthy human connections. Obviously, that's not the case for everyone, and you can be a perfectly happy bodybuilder with healthy bonds to those you love. But the amount of people who partake in the sport with a history of loneliness or frustration or just flat out self-hate makes me sad, honestly. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you're into bodybuilding, that's fine. But if you're gonna do it, you should do so carefully. Celebrate your body for what it is, not just what it could someday become. I guess now's a good time as any to ask ourselves a question that's been staring us in the face this whole time. Fellas, is it gay? Yes, kind of. It's complicated. Before we go on, I think it's important that we recognize that not all homosexual libido always results in sexual attraction. It's perfectly normal to be more attracted to another gender instead of your own. But your brain still has to figure out your stance to others of your same gender. Unless you're gender fluid aroace, in which case, cheers to that. Anyway. Dudes. As we went through, around the mid-1900s was probably the time where bodybuilding was most under surveillance. A gay panic, which obviously went further than just exercise. If you've heard about the Hays Code, this shouldn't surprise you, because by that point, bodybuilding had been so thoroughly dethroned as the most optimal way to exercise for health. So whoever was doing it were doing so because they liked it. And why would a guy be so interested in the male body? That initial reaction was honestly kind of understandable. Bodybuilding is, after all, a cult of the male image. Men obsess over their bodies and compare them to each other. Even the straightest bodybuilder covets the body of another man. In many societies around the world, the mere idea that the male body can be beautiful or enviable is pretty taboo on its own. And unlike other sports where that focus is projected onto a ball or a goal or a target, bodybuilding is oriented towards nothing but the body itself. To an outsider's perspective, this might just look like lust, veiled by a thin glamour of fitness. The thing is, in practice, that's usually not the case. There are a lot of gay bodybuilders. A lot. But there are also many straight ones. Bisexuals, pansexuals, asexuals. They're all here. Everyone is here. That's because looking at the sport is not the same thing as doing it yourself. Bodybuilding does not inherently spark the interest in men towards each other. For the most part, that interest is already there. What it and any other sport does is allow boys to process those feelings in a way that is socially acceptable. From the beginning, bodybuilding has been powered by an engine of identification. Our good friend Zando claimed he was a weakling until he was inspired by a Greek statue. Later on, hundreds of bodybuilders would fill that same role to thousands of young boys. Inspired by admiration and envy, men men enter into a world where they are made a promise, not of sexual prowess or even of praise. It's a promise to banish any weakness from the flesh, but you don't snuff it, you hide it. "Here's the kind of man I build," announces Charles Atlas. But do you want to be with that man? No. Instead, do you want to be that man? Yes. Homoerotic desire is turned into narcissistic identification. Personally, I don't think that narcissism is inherently wrong or evil. At the end of the day, it's just the way your brain works. You can't really help it, and what actually makes it good or bad is what you do with those judgments and biases. But I've always scored really high on narcissism scales, so of course I would think that, wouldn't I? Johann Sebastian Freud identified 4 ways in which narcissism may take shape, one of which is the love for what one would like to be. For example, this type of desire might manifest when a young man finds someone who could be that ideal role, a hero. However, that young man might learn that the desire to be with is unacceptable, and so he has to find something else to do with it. The ideal self goes from external to internal. He learns to be like the man in order to gain his social standing. In other words, a man's sense of social responsibility is founded on the folding of the libido into the ego. Narcissism as an accusation is often misused because I think the simplest definition is also misleading. Being in love with oneself is very limited as an idea. If these men were in love with themselves, they wouldn't be doing all that. The real answer, which Freud points at, is that narcissism is being in love with the idealized version of yourself, the hero within. It's not love. It's aspiration. This is the entire reason why gladiator movies, bodybuilders, and superheroes are popular with boys. First, they usually tell stories about justice, bravery, and doing the right thing. Then, pivoting on that social virtue, any homosexual libido is redirected inward. Desire not the daddy before you, but yearn instead for the one within. If this is narcissism, it's not deployed to turn men gay. It's to stop them from being gay. That's what Arnie's entire appeal hinged on. He taught America that there was nothing to fear from bodybuilding, that it wasn't an inherently deviant interest. If anything, he used his physique as a way to reclaim power for men. The radical changes of sexual politics in the 60s and 70s had all but disgust for the male body. Especially for conservatives, Arnie standing proud was a protest against that, an affirmation that masculinity itself was and would always be worth something. You can see this also in the films that starred bodybuilders. They were men of action, war heroes, pure-blooded killers, all disavowing any form of passivity. The more exaggerated the physique, the more it had to justify itself through violence. But this isn't masculinity taken at face value. This is male drag. This is camp.
A shambling and shaking weapons arsenal that reveals itself to be a walking advertisement for the insecurities of the 1980s man.
The end result is paranoia. If homosexuality is turned inward, then it must be policed and regulated at all times. That's why young men are so worried about what is gay and what isn't. Anything they don't like, they call gay, even if it has nothing to do with desire. Boys have little social standing, and they're anxious not to lose it. Let me blow your mind with something obvious. Masculinity is proven to other men, not to women. Now, it bears repeating that even on the builtest of builders, attraction towards men is not always as strong as that towards women. Some people do be straight. But still, no matter how big or small, attraction toward men must be hammered into something useful, sublimated. If a man cannot covet another man's body under any circumstances, then the only male body he is allowed to enjoy is his own. So the central drive of bodybuilding becomes one with the obsession of masculinity, size.
As the bodybuilder's chest swells, so quite literally does his ego. The more manly the man's body, the more he can direct his homosexual libido towards himself.
Fantasies of growth merge with the desire to be more male.
The dead-end job, unfulfilled relationship, or generalized angst may continue, but you can feel better by controlling the last vestige of your ever-shrinking empire. your body.
The bodybuilder is, by definition, someone who creates the body that he wants, which is cool. But the counter of that is that in the process, he destroys the one he hates, the one he has. No matter if you optimize your training, your nutrition, all of it, bodybuilding will always fall short of its promise. Narcissus fell in love with his reflection, but the bodybuilder can't. By nature, he cannot reach his destination. Every time he looks in the mirror, either to train or pose or just by accident, he will always find a ghost. I knew you when you were nothing, and if you stop or slow down for just one moment, I can bring you right back to nothing.
Part 5. The first man was a fighter.
Of all the labors of Hercules, possibly the most well known is his fight against the Nemean lion. It was the first, and from then on, Herc would wear his pelt as clothing and as a trophy. The hunter's arrows bounced right off it, so Hercules had to wrestle the lion. Another famous struggle is that against Anateus, a giant who challenged passing strangers to a wrestling match. A fight that was not entirely fair, because his mother was the earth, so he was invincible when in contact with her. Hercules knew what to do. He beat him by wrestling once again, lifting Anateus off the ground. And there was a third case with Cacus as well. Hercules' first instinct against pretty much any obstacle was to wrestle his way through. This haircut is driving me crazy. I grew it out specifically for this video, and I'm so done with it. Looking through the histories of different cultures around the world, you will invariably find wrestling. By nature, it's one of the oldest sports. It shares a simplicity with its contemporaries. Run fast, jump high, go at each other. Wrestling has taken many different shapes throughout time, but in essence, it has stayed the same. Two opponents face off against each other and attempt to take charge and score points. The rules have changed a lot, and they continue to do so, with some iterations being more practical than others. But it's been with us since forever. There are also hundreds of different variations on the same basic rule set, and I think that's because of the almost ceremonial nature of wrestling. That might have to do with the fact that you have to play by the rules. If you don't, none of it works. This is not MMA. Unlike many other combat sports, wrestling is not about violence, it's about control. When you're on the mat, both you and your opponent kind of stop being people and become forces. Any creative expression in wrestling happens within the limits of that particular rule set. The rules dictate the action, the pace, the meaning. A double leg takedown, sweep single, a suplex. That's why it's so captivating. Once you wrap your head around the rules, it becomes a conversation, a debate, a dance. Yeah, okay, maybe not. Wrestling has survived through the ages when other sports don't, because it is just as grimy and gritty as it is grandiose and spectacular. In September of 2023, I stepped into a wrestling club for the first time in my life. Having no experience with it, I started from zero. While I was learning at my own pace, the first few months were entirely overwhelming with how much I was exposed to. As I started to understand the depths of the sport, I came to realize the absolute mountain that lay ahead of me. For me, as an outsider, it felt like the climb was so high and so complicated that I was better off staying away. So I made the decision to quit. I went to my last class and I didn't tell anyone but my close friend, and suddenly my opinion flipped. I was speaking to my coach, and without knowing what was going on in my head, he let me know how easy it was to be unable to wrestle. Bodybuilding for years had instilled in me such confidence in my body, in my strength, that there was much that I was taking for granted. When it came to wrestling, it didn't matter if I never got any good. The fact is that I could wrestle and I was having fun, so who cares about the climb? Since then, I've not only been able to practice more, but I've started volunteering with the club, and it's been such a rewarding experience. Seeing the teammates grow and rise to the occasion. Win or not, doesn't matter. I also had the chance to visit the Olympics in Paris last year, and it was an incredibly beautiful experience to see the sport celebrated like that. The Nemean lion might have been quite famous, but Renaissance artists were also captivated by a different chapter of Hercules' life, one that was not even a labor. It's a morality tale. The story goes that when Hercules was young, two women appeared to him and presented him a split path for the future. Different storytellers give them different names, like virtue and vice, salvation and sin, renown and self-indulgence. The fable is so obvious that it lends itself well to paintings. Pleasure offers an easy path, one without worries and lots of distractions to whittle our time away with. The other is a harder path, less comfortable. The first is fatal. The second, tougher, but will lead you to higher highs. I've often heard men say that they don't want an easy life. Stories like the choice of Hercules show us how we feel the need to give meaning to our pain. It's a defense mechanism against the random nature of suffering. If there's one thing that I've learned from wrestling, is that success and failure are just as arbitrary as pain and glory. I don't know, just don't glorify your suffering. Just because it's unfair doesn't mean it has any meaning.
Part 6. The Fall of the House of Atlas.
With all we've seen, whether it's history, art, games, movies, TikTok, I think it's unsurprising how sports are tied to gender construction, and in particular, masculinity. From the many decades of evolving feminism, we've learned that the female gender is ascribed onto women, put upon them. In contrast, masculinity is proven. It is earned. It's fought for. The trick is, hegemonic masculinity, which is to say that archetypal male, as a goal, is not a finish line. It is not something you achieve and then you're done with it. You have to constantly be fighting, earning, building. The victory over masculinity is something that must be consistently exercised to remain successful. I think a good analogy is the UFC, for example. One rises above the division, wins the belt, and then has to defend it until someone inevitably takes it over. All this to say, there is no resolution to masculinity. A man can hardly ever assume that he's become a man. Being a man is a state of constant negotiation. It's now easy to see why aesthetics and fantasies of power are so appealing to us. They validate the perceived value of the strength we have achieved, give meaning to our sacrifices, and inspire our potential. It's a pushback on the fact that someday, inevitably, the prize will be snatched from our hands as well. All we can hope for is that when that day comes, we'll have had a positive impact on the world, and our struggles will have been worth something. Legacy is the burden of being labeled as active by society. Media these days is designed to capitalize on this fear of emasculation. We are offered glimpses of power and achievement, of unshakable strength and valor. And what does this hinge on? We've been over this. Say it with me. Desire. We are socialized to misrecognize desire. The things we want to achieve become entangled with the person we want to become, with the person we want to be with. Identification and desire. It doesn't matter if you're gay, straight, bi, trans, who cares? If masculinity is about social standing, then it's about how you find and create meaning with those around you. The developed, muscular, built male body can be a sign of strength, of virility, of success. Like with the Greeks, an exaltation of all that is beautiful, sacred, and good. On the other hand, it could just as easily be seen as an insecurity, a nervous dislike of any body that is not demonstrably male. When I started working out and I got my first muscle growth spurt, I would be showing it off all the time. An annoying and constant reinforcement that I was strong and successfully male. But who was it for? Honestly, more for myself than the people around me. No one ever questioned my masculinity. Why would they? It's none of their business. Actually, I just remembered, at the time, there was this straight guy who constantly insisted on giving me a lap dance. Irrelevant. But any time I would walk past a mirror and catch a glimpse of my arm looking small and thin, I'd get nervous. I'd be reminded of the people in my life commenting on how skinny I was. Family members and friends joking that I was so skinny that I looked like a dinosaur, it is kind of funny. And so I'd hit the gym and I'd mega fibroblast my muscles, all to silence that nervous self-policing that I've been carrying around for decades. I was chasing a muscularity that presented as unquestionably successfully male, and it would override any other reading of my body. But here's the twist, which you've probably been expecting for a while. When you read a body like a group of symbols, like in bodybuilding, you create a body language, right? A set of codes and clauses of what is good and bad, yeah? Well, in wrestling, that is entirely useless. Language about size and striations and all that goes right out the window. The vocabulary of takedowns, of grappling, of control is so wide that hardly one thing becomes key. The questions being posed are entirely different. What does the optimal shoulder look like? The bicep? The answer is that it doesn't matter. What's actually important is what you learn to do with it. Proportions are irrelevant, only coming into play when you ask yourself what is your body best suited for. Everything has a use. Long arms? Short legs? What about the other way around? You can find what works for you and capitalize on it. In wrestling, the power held by the image of hegemonic masculinity dissolves the second that you step onto the mat. Well, maybe not entirely, because there is this subject of intimidation. You could be going up against this big tall guy with huge muscles and you might be afraid, which fair enough. But if you let that happen, you're doing the sport wrong. Mental game and all that. There is this concept which we won't get too much into called the magic circle. For now, we'll say that it's basically like a game. A space where the rules of real life are suspended for a while. It happens pretty easily and kids do it all the time. If I kill you in a game, you don't die in real life. In Minecraft, if I win at Fortune Street or Monopoly, I'm not actually rich. One of the key parts of the magic circle is that we're not supposed to gain anything real from it. It's just for fun. We play for the sake of it. Wrestling is an excellent example of what it's like to step into the magic circle. If we're having a match, it doesn't matter who wins. The rules of real life are set aside and we are allowed to move and touch each other differently, to use our skills, to find joy in the act of what is essentially play. And if you beat me, what does it matter? Even if I lose every single time, none of it is real. When you wrestle and you get on the mat, you are literally stepping into the magic circle. In contrast, there is no magic circle in bodybuilding. One might be tempted to say that it's the gym, but any bodybuilder worth their salt can easily disprove that. The gym is just one of 3 pillars of the sport: training, eating, and sleeping. When you put it all together, you see that bodybuilding is just chemistry. That's because the sport of bodybuilding happens inside your body. It happens to your body. As soon as the wrestling match ends and you step off the mat, you exit the magic circle. But in bodybuilding, you are not afforded that luxury. Everything is painfully real, and you carry the consequences everywhere you go. Anything you eat, you drink, how much you sleep, how much you walk, there is no distinction between play and work. No break from reality. In a way, bodybuilding is an assertion that our bodies are inescapable weight, a sack of meat that cannot help but become weak or feeble unless constantly monitored. The original sin was to have a body at all.
Part 7. Toil is the bringer of beautiful rest.
According to Greek myth, Narcissus was a beautiful young man. Arrogant and proud, he had the world in the palm of his hand. When he was a child, though, he received a warning from the prophet Tiresias. Narcissus would live a long and healthy life, so long as he never knew himself. One day, a young man fell for Narcissus, but his feelings were unrequited as they often were with the man. Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, heard the man's pleas and cursed Narcissus never to be loved by who he desired. On Mount Helicon, Narcissus happened upon a pond in which he discovered his reflection, a gorgeous image endowed with all the beauty a man could desire. This perfect grace, however, could not return his love. Narcissus obsessed over this just as much as those he had turned down. So he wasted away, worn out by the futility of his love, turning into a downward-gazing flower. No matter how much pride a bodybuilder takes in his improvement, one sad truth is almost universal. Like Narcissus, his affection entangle him to the unreal, an idealized, immortal image of himself.
To love one's image is not the same as to love oneself.
In his own set of myths, Hercules set out to right his wrongs. He was burdened with one task after another, where his wits, cunning, and strength were repeatedly tested. He always emerged victorious, proving himself and excelling in the end. It wasn't until a previously defeated enemy tricked him within the intimacy of his own marriage that Hercules met his end. Poisoned and scalded, Hercules' body eroded in a matter of seconds with nothing he could do to stop it. Hercules was defined by his strife, so it makes sense that his story could not end in any other way than complete annihilation. His body was little else than a tool to master the elements, and his struggles the only thing that gave his life meaning. Here we have two models of masculinity, and in truth, neither is better than the other. Narcissus loves his image. On the other hand, Hercules has no love for his own body, no respect for his health. One is inward and selfish, the other is outward and self-effacing. Led to their ultimate expressions, both lead us to self-destruction. So where does that leave us? In truth, I'm no better than anyone else. In fact, I'm worse. I want to disrespect my body so bad every minute of every day in every way I can. You know, sometimes I think I'm just doing all of this and that just so that later I can self-destruct even harder. Okay, let's sweep that under the rug for now and keep moving. So I go the opposite way and I buy into the fantasy. I want to be that ideal self. I want to be the hero. I want to be admired. I also want to be tested, and I want to win fairly. I often push myself with no regard for my well-being, zeroed in on excellence. I think to find satisfaction, we have to blend the two. Self-esteem alongside humility. To take pride in your own achievements, but not be consumed by the idea of what you could become. All that does is effectively devalue what you do have. For me, the only way forward is to enjoy both. To equally find joy in the pursuit of what I want as much as in learning to enjoy what I already have to the fullest. To know my strengths and let those guide me more than my deficiencies. I want to continue bodybuilding, and I also want to keep on wrestling and become better at it. So I guess that's where you'll find me. Sandwiched between Hercules and Narcissus. Stupid. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. This video was really fun to make. I have a second channel where we talk about movies and games and books and TV shows, so feel free to check it out if you are so inclined. Consider leaving a like if you want, it is very helpful, but for now I'll see you next time.
Part 8. Why am I so gay?